Assalamualaikum. I welcome you in another video lecture for this subject HCI. Now previously in introduction to research methods we briefly discussed about need finding. Now with this lecture we are going to dive deep the into the domain of need finding or into the characteristics of need finding. So the first stage of the design life cycle is need finding or requirements gathering, which we already discussed in Introduction to Research Methods lecture. So the biggest mistake that the designer can jump is jumping to the design process before understanding the user or the task. This is the stage where we go and try to find out what the user really needs. We want to develop a deep understanding of the task they are trying to accomplish and why. As we do this, it's important to try to come in with as few preconceived notions as possible. There's an old age saying that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is similar. If you come in having already decided what approach you want to take, it's tempting to only see the problem in terms of the approach you have chosen. So we are going to go through a process that attempts to avoid as many preconceived notions as possible. We are going to start by defining some general questions we want to answer throughout the data gathering process about who the user is, what they are doing, and what they need. Then we'll go through several methods of generating answers to those questions to gain a better understanding of the user. Then we'll talk about how to formalize the data we gather into a shareable model of the task and a list of requirements for our ultimate interface. Note that each of these tools could get a lesson on its own on how to do it. So I'll try to provide some additional resources to read further on the tools you choose to use. Now before we start our need finding exercises, we also want to enter with some understanding of the data we want to gather. These are the questions we ultimately want to answer. That's not to say we should be answering them every step of the way, but rather we want to gather the data necessary to come to a conclusion at the end. Now there are lots of inventories of the types of data you could gather, but here's one useful list. 1. Who are the users? What are their ages, genders, levels of expertise? 2. Where are the users? What is their environment? Number 3. What is the context of the task? What else is competing for users' attention? 4. What are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? 5. Right now, what they need. What are the physical objects? What information do they need? What collaborators do they need? 6. What are their tasks? What are they doing physically, cognitively, and socially? And 7. What are the subtasks? How do they accomplish those subtasks? When you are designing your need finding methods, each thing you do should match up with one or more of these questions. Now in order to do some real need finding, the first thing we need to do is identify the problem space. Where is the task occurring? What else is going on? What are the user's explicit and implicit needs? We'll talk about some of the methods for doing that in this lesson. But before we get into those methods, we want to understand the scope of the space we are looking at. So consider the difference between these two actions in the video. Notice that in each of these I am doing the same task, or the user is doing the same task, turning off the alarm. But in the first scene, we are focusing very narrowly on the interaction between the user and the interface. In the latter, we are taking into consideration a broader view of the problem space. We could zoom out even further if we wanted to and ask questions about where and why people need alarm systems in the first place. That might lead us to designing things like security systems for dorm rooms or checking systems for office buildings. As we are going about need finding, we want to make sure we are taking the broad approach. Understanding the entire problem space in which we are interested, not just focusing narrowly on the user's interaction with a particular interface. So in our exploration of methods for need finding, we are going to start with the most authentic types of general observation, then move through progressively more targeted types of need finding. Now, just as we want to get an idea of the physical space of the problem, we also want to get an idea of the space of the user. In other words, we want to understand who we are designing for. That comes up a lot when doing design alternatives and prototyping. But we also want to make sure to gather information about the full range of users for whom we are designing. So let's take the example of designing an audiobook app for people that exercise. Now, am I interested in audiobooks just for kids or for adults too? Am I interested in experts who are exercising or novices at it? Am I interested in experts listening to audiobooks? Or am I interested in novices at that as well? Those are pretty key questions. They differentiate whether I am designing for business people who want to be able to exercise while reading or exercisers who want to be able to do something else while exercising. The task is similar for both, but the audience, their motivations, and their needs are different. So I need to identify these different types of users and perform need finding exercises on all of them. One of the most successful products of all time exceeded because of the attention to user types. The Sony Walkman became such a dramatic success because they identified different needs for different types of people, designed their product in a way that it met all those needs, but then they marketed specifically to those different types of individuals. You can read more about that in a book called Doing Cultural Studies by Hugh Mackay and Linda James. Now let's see some 5 tips for need finding and for avoiding bias. So during need finding, there are some significant considerations that need to be made to avoid biasing your results. So let's look at these 5 tips. Number 1, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the phenomenon where we see what we want to see. We enter with some preconceived ideas of what we will see, and we only notice the things that confirm our prior beliefs. Try to avoid this by specifically looking for signs that you are wrong, by testing your beliefs empirically, and by involving multiple individuals in the need finding process. Number 2, observer bias. When we are interacting directly with users, we may subconsciously bias them. We might be more helpful, for example, with users using the interface that we design compared to the ones that other people design. On the surface, we might accidentally phrase questions in a way that elicits the answer that we want to hear. Try to avoid this by separating experimenters with motives from the participants, by heavily scripting interactions with users, and by having someone else review your interview scripts and your surveys for leading questions. Number 3, social desirability bias. People tend to be nice. People want to help. If you are testing an interface and the participants know that you are the designer of the interface, they will want to say something nice about it that makes you happy. But that gets in the way of getting good data. Try to avoid this by hiding what the social desirable response is by conducting more naturalistic observation and by recording objective data. Number 4. Voluntary response bias. Studies have shown that people with stronger opinions are more likely to respond to optional surveys. You can see this often in online store reviews. The most common responses are often 5s and 1s. For us, that means if we prefer quantitative analysis on surveys, we risk oversampling the more extreme views. Avoid this by limiting how much of the survey content is shown to users before they begin survey, and by confirming any conclusions with other methods. Number 5. Recall bias. Studies have also shown that people aren't always very good at recalling what they did, what they thought, or how they felt during an activity they completed in the past. That can lead to misleading and incorrect data. Try to avoid this by studying tasks and context, by having users think out loud during activities or conducting interviews during the activity itself. Now, these biases can be largely controlled also by making sure to engage in multiple forms of need finding. A great way for me to start understanding what it's like to need an audiobook app for exercising is to come somewhere where people are exercising and just watch them exercise. For certain tasks, a great way for us to understand the user's need is to simply watch. This is called naturalistic observation, observing people in their natural context. So, I am fortunate that I actually live across the street from a park, so I can sit here in my rocking chair on my porch and just watch people exercising. Now, I want to start with very specific observations and then generalize out to more abstract tasks. That way, I'll observe something called confirmation bias, which is basically when you see what you want to see. So, what do I notice? Well, I notice that there's a lot of different types of exercisers. There are walkers, joggers, runners. I see some rollerbladers. I see some people doing yoga. I see a lot of people riding bikes, but the bikers seem to be broken into two different kinds of groups. I see a lot of people biking kind of leisurely, but I also see some bikers who are a little bit more strenuous about it. I am also noticing that while joggers might be able to stop and start pretty quickly, that's harder for someone riding a bike. So I might want to avoid designs that force the user to pull out their phone a lot, because that's going to be dangerous and awkward for people riding bikes. Now, I also see people exercising in groups and also people exercising individually. For those people exercising in groups, I don't actually know if they would be interested in this. Listening to something might kind of defeat the purpose of exercising together. So I'm going to have to note that down as a question I want to ask people later. I also see that many people tend to stretch before and after exercising, and I am wondering if we can use that. Then we can have some kind of a starting and ending sequence for this, so that a single session is kind of bookending by both stretching and interacting with our app. Note that by just watching people engage in the task of exercising, I am gathering an enormous amount of information that might affect my design. But note also that while naturalistic observation is great, I am limited ethically in what I can do. I can't interact with users directly, and I cannot capture identifying information like videos and photographs. That's why I can't show you what I am seeing out here. I am also limited in that I don't know anything about what those users are thinking. I don't know if the people working out in groups would want to be able to listen to audiobooks while they are doing yoga. I don't know if Bluetooth headsets would be problematic for people riding bike. I need to do a lot more before I get to the design phase. But this has been very informative in my understanding of the problem space and giving me things I can ask people later on. Now here are 5 quick tips for doing naturalistic observation. Number 1. Take notes. Don't just sit around watching for a while. Be prepared to gather targeted information and observations about what you see. Number 2. Start specific and then abstract. Write down the individual little actions you see people doing before trying to interpret or summarize them. If you jump to summarizing too soon, you risk tunnel vision. Number 3. Spread out your sessions. Rather than sitting somewhere for 2 hours, one day and then moving on, try to observe in shorter 10 to 15-minute sessions several times. You may find understanding different information, and your growing understanding and reflection on past exercises will inform your future sessions. Number 4. Find the partner. Observe together with someone else. Take your own notes and then compare them later, so you can see if you all interpreted the same scenarios or actions in the same way. Number 5. Look for questions. Naturalistic observation should inform the questions you decide to ask participants in more targeted need-finding exercises. You don't need to have all the answers based on observation alone. What you need is questions to investigate further. You can also refer to these sources for more knowledge on naturalistic observations. Sometimes it's not just enough to watch people engaging in a task. Sometimes we want to experience a task for ourselves. So that's what I'm going to do. I listen to audiobooks a lot. I don't really exercise. I should, but I don't. But I'm going to try this out. So I've got my audiobook queued up. I've got my mic on so I can take notes as I run. So I'm going to go on a jog and see what I discover. So wait for me, I'll be back soon. So, what did I learn? I learned that I'm out of shape for one thing. I already knew that, but I learned it again. I also learned that this app would be very useful for anyone doing participant observation on exercisers, because I kept having to stop to record notes for myself, which I could done with this app that I'm trying to implement. But aside from that, I noticed that unexpected things happen pretty often that made me wish that I could easily go back in my book. Or sometimes there are just things I just wanted to hear again. But there was no easy way to do that. I also noticed that there's definitely the need there for me. I already planned to listen to everything again now that I am home, because there were notes I wanted to take that I couldn't take easily. I also noticed that while sometimes I wanted to take notes, I also just want to leave a bookmark. Now we do have to be careful here though. Remember, you are not your user. When you are working as a participant observer, you can avail useful insights, but you shouldn't over represent your own experiences. You shouldn't use this experience as a participant observer to inform what you ask users going forward. So let's zoom in a little bit more on what the user actually does, or what we can do naturalistic and participant observation without having to directly interact much with our users. We need to get inside users' heads a little more to understand what they are thinking and doing. If you are trying to design interfaces to make existing tasks easier, one way to research that is to look at the hacks that users presently employ. How do they use interfaces in non-intended ways to accomplish tasks? Or how do they break out of the interface to accomplish a task that could have been accomplished with an interface? If you are designing a task meant to be performed at a desk, looking at the person's workspace can be a great way of accomplishing this. So for example, I have 6 monitors around, and yet you still see post-it notes on my computer. How could I possibly need more screen real estate? Well, post-it notes can't be covered up. they don't take away from the existing screen real estate. They are visible even when the computer is off. So this implicit notes here is the way to hack around the limitations of the computer interface. Now when you are looking at hacks, it's important to not just look at what the user does and assume you understand why. Look at their workaround and ask them why they are using them. Find out why they don't just use the interface that's currently in place. You might find they just don't know about them, which presents a different kind of design challenge. Now hacks are related to another method we can use to uncover user needs as well, which are called errors. Whereas hacks are ways users get around the interface to accomplish their tasks, errors are slips or mistakes that users frequently make while performing the task within the interface. So I'll just stop here and I'll upload another video while continuing this topic of hacks and workarounds along with errors and slips. So stay tuned.